Do I think Cyno is a badly written character? No, obviously not. Cyno, like a lot of the Sumeru cast, is what I consider to be one of the better written characters in Genshin. He is without a doubt one of the most hyped up characters and one of the most anticipated releases in Genshin, probably only being rivaled by Scaramouche and Ayaka for obvious reasons. Cyno has great design, he has a really brief but impactful role in the webtoon, and is the featured character in the Travail trailer as basically the face of Sumeru. And he finally came out in 2022, just a few weeks after the initial release of Sumeru itself. And in Sumeru, he has a prominent role in the Archon quest, he has fully fleshed out relationships with the rest of the cast, so then why the hell am I still complaining? Well, because where the hell is his lore? As of the writing of this video, we are just one patch away from Fontaine, and after 6 desert expansion packs, we still don't have any substantial Cyno lore. But before we get into all that, let's discuss why I think Hoyo is wasting so much potential when it comes to Cyno. You see, Cyno is great for a lot of reasons, one of them being his personality. Cyno, even without his complete lore, is already one of the most beloved and interesting characters in the game for a number of reasons. And that is because Cyno has one of the most unique personalities out of the entire cast, not just Sumeru, honestly. Similar to Tartaglia, Cyno has two very different sides to him. On one side, we have General Mahamatra Cyno, who is cold, ruthless, and calculating, whose name strikes fear in the academia. Like legit, you will meet NPCs in the game who are genuinely terrified at the sight of him. A lot of scholars see him as like the devil who's basically there to ruin their research with his pesky sense of justice. And it seems like he has always been that way ever since he became a Matra. On the other hand, we also often see a side of Cyno that is, for a lack of a better word, a dork. He's a nerd who spends way too much money on Genius Invocation TCG and who makes the most awful yet lovable jokes that will make you want to bleach your ears. And while some people feel like this duality makes Cyno's personality feel disjointed and have caused a lot of mischaracterization, I personally like seeing someone who's so hyper intense at work having hobbies and interests outside of their job. It makes Cyno feel like a real person who just so happens to have a high-ranking position at his job. I have seen people characterize Cyno, at least during the initial release of Sumeru, as someone who just cracks a lot of jokes because he's actually this wacky guy, and a lot of people were confused when Cyno didn't just randomly crack jokes during the Archon quest and in his story quest. But that's because Cyno isn't this wacky person. He was always hyper serious about everything, especially his job. So the last thing he would do when he's at work or in work mode is cracking jokes. Cyno is always intense, like always, be it in his work or the way he cares for his friends, his hobbies, and his jokes. Cyno is a man of extremes. He is the type of person that doesn't know how to relax. So even when he's not in work mode, he only makes jokes because he thinks it will make the people around him feel more at ease and comfortable. Probably because he's aware that his presence alone is enough to intimidate someone into a mental breakdown. And when people don't laugh at his corny jokes, he just explains it to them, and his subordinates, the other Matras, usually force themselves to laugh. I also just recently learned that a lot of the students in the academia think that whenever they hear dry laughter coming from Cyno's office, it's because they think it's the Matras laughing at the misery of whoever is on the receiving end of Cyno's judgment. But it's actually just the Matras being subjected to Cyno's god-awful jokes, and I find this fact so hilarious, and I love little details like this because I think it adds to him as a character, and this has made him one of the most interesting characters to follow because people just react to Cyno's personality differently. So let's talk about Cyno's relationships with other characters and how it adds to his writing. And lucky for us, Cyno interacts with a lot of people in the Archon quest, in the story quest, in events. He's always with other characters. The one we see him interact with the most is obviously his best friend, Tignari. Tignari is his best friend and is someone who understands him the most, and is usually the only one in the room who can actually tell whether Cyno is being serious or not. He is also shown to be one of the few people that Cyno trusts completely and wholeheartedly, which is hilarious because if you didn't know, the way Tignari and Cyno became friends in the first place is because Cyno suspected Tignari of academic corruption, but he soon discovers that Tignari was just a bit too popular with the other students and dropped his suspicions, and they became besties. By the time we meet them in the Archon quest, they're best friends, and Tignari's warning is also how Cyno first first became suspicious of the academia's shady experiments and also the corrupt sages. Cyno is usually the most relaxed, or as relaxed as Cyno can get when he's with Tignari. We can see this when they hang out together with their friend group, and of course when they're with Kale. Kale, unlike what some people would believe, isn't actually scared of Cyno himself, like himself as a person. It's just that Cyno reminds Kale of her past and her trauma, and it's why she gets so uncomfortable around him. After Cyno rescued Kale in Mondstadt and brought her to Sumeru and placed her under Tignari's care, after her very traumatic tutorial experience, he continually visits her and just to see how she's doing, and is shown to have genuine concern and care about her education and growth. He whips out jokes during their dinners and even tells her multiple times to just refer to him as Cyno instead of General Mahamatra, and it's honestly so cute and heartwarming. His interactions and dynamic with Kale tells, or rather shows us, the players, what kind of person Cyno truly is. And the idea of them slowly bonding through Genius Invocation TCG just warms my heart. Tignari, Cyno, and Kale's found family dynamic is honestly one of the most wholesome and surprisingly fleshed out relationships in the game. I say surprising because one of the biggest problems, at least in the earlier days of Genshin, is that not a lot of characters are actually allowed to interact with one another. For example, we know that Zhongli works for Hu Tao, but it literally took a full year before we actually got to see them interact on screen. And even then, it was in a limited time event that most new players can't even experience. But Hoyo has definitely improved on this. Character interactions in the newer patches don't really feel like it's forced or it's some kind of weird roll call like it was in the older patches. And we definitely got to see the improvement with Cyno, Tignari, and Kale. And it's not just them. Outside of Tignari and Kale, Cyno has fleshed out relationships with most of the Sumeru cast. We have his friend group that was revealed through what is probably still my favorite character trailer ever. And yes, I'm talking about that trailer with Alhaitham and Kave. Cyno and Alhaitham definitely had a rocky start in the Archon quest, but again, because the quest was so well done and we got to actually see them interact on screen, we as the players can genuinely believe that they gained a lot of respect for each other while fighting for the same cause, despite being so different from one another. So it just felt natural to see them become friends and hang out and gossip. I just love the Sumeru cast so much, they deserve their own video. Nahida, although we haven't gotten as much screen time of Cyno and Nahida together, it's implied through voice lines that Nahida is one of the very few people who find Cyno's jokes to be funny and interesting and even tries to explain them to us, the players. So through that, we can kind of get a sense of what their working relationship is like, and it's honestly adorable. Seeing Cyno and Nahida form this working relationship is really adorable because at the start of the Sumeru Archon quest, Cyno was basically clueless about Kusanali or Nahida. Cyno was just more familiar with Rukkhadevata like the rest of Sumeru was, so we can't really blame him for that. And finally, Lisa. We know from the webtoon that Lisa is the one who contacted Cyno. Well, not Cyno. Technically, she contacted her former professor, who then sent Cyno to Mondstadt to help Kale, and she was also his senior in the academia. And at long last, we finally got to see them together again in a limited time event for a whopping 2 seconds. I'm just kidding, it was 4 minutes. And I have a lot more to say about this interaction, but more on this later. Another thing that makes Cyno feel like such a well-written character is that Hoyo gave him enough screen time for him to actually have some development. We got to see a lot, and I do mean a lot, of Cyno since his debut banner. Again, Cyno has a very prominent role in the Archon quest, and this makes him one of the central characters in Sumeru's lore. Sumeru in general did a good job in establishing its characters, and one of the many things that the Archon quest did right was it allowed for Cyno's growth as a character while also simultaneously moving the plot forward. As we have established, Cyno is intense. He has a very specific moral code that he follows, so it's only natural that once Cyno's suspicion towards the academia grew and later on confirmed when the Grand Sage denied his request for audit, he packed up his bags and exiled himself like the king that he is. He does this to essentially stay out of the academia's watch so that he can freely investigate without being taken out halfway. But as we later on learn alongside Cyno himself, the academia was able to predict his every move because he's a bit too intense, especially when it comes to adhering to his principles. And then with the help of the Traveler, Alhaitham, and the rest of the Sumeru cast, Cyno at long last was able to arrest the Grand Sage, deliver the edgiest line known to man, and finally freeing Nahida from her long imprisonment. Can I just say, even if this line is as edgy as it gets, it's somehow endearing and badass because Hoyo did such a good job in writing Cyno as a character. It's a line that fits him really well, and it's one of my favorite lines in the quest. Then we have his story quest, which was good. I personally enjoyed it, but I would be lying if I say I wasn't slightly disappointed. His story quest is ultimately about Damatra, specifically his former mentor / partner, Taj. The quest shows the lengths that the Matra are willing to go through in order to uphold their principles and justice, and the price that they have to pay while doing so. For example, Taj lost his son because he chose to uphold his or Damatra's principles even to the very end. And this is the part where I'm going to start complaining, like I always do. Don't get me wrong, I think his story quest is good. Like, it's a solid story quest. It's emotional, it gives a lot of context on how Damatra operates, how Cyno in general operates. It builds on how being a Matra apparently sucks because you're expected to put your humanity aside in order to adhere to the law. Basically showing us the players that being a Matra is a thankless job. Like, people hate you for being a Matra. The scholars in Sumeru think Cyno is just out to get them, to hinder their research. And the Matra are always expected to put aside their own humanity in order to do what's right, or at least what is right according to the law. The quest also expands a lot on the way Sumeru operates as a society, but it doesn't really expand on Cyno as a character. His story quests show that Cyno, despite his resolve and principles, is a good-hearted person and will try his best to help people while also adhering to the law. He does this by keeping his word to the merchant and his sickly daughter, and later on arresting 300 criminals by himself like the mad lad that he is. While all of that is interesting and we get to see nice interactions with him and Thignari, but ultimately it's all stuff we already know about him. We already know that Cyno is ruthless as a Matra. We already know that despite all of that, he is still reasonable and has a big heart and doesn't follow the academia blindly. These are things that we already established in the Archon quest. His story quest is great, but compared to Dihia's, for example, it doesn't really add a lot to his character. Dihia's story quest expanded on things that weren't even mentioned in the Archon quest. And by the end of her quest, we learn so much about Dihia's life, and it adds a lot of layers to her as a character. And that brings me to my main complaint about Cyno, and why I think Hoyo missed so much potential when it comes to his story and character writing. They're gatekeeping his lore. I know it's probably for a future release or event or something, but god damn it, it's almost been a year since Cyno's release and there's still no lore in sight. We unlocked most of the desert already. We're about to enter Fontaine. Where the hell is his backstory, Hoyo? And knowing Hoyo, it's probably going to be a limited time event, aka Cyno is going to get the albedo treatment, and it's such a shame because if his backstory ends up being revealed in a time-limited event, then so many people are going to miss out on one of the most three-dimensional characters in the game. And if I'm wrong and they don't do that, then great. I want everyone and their grandparents, both old and new players alike, to know that Cyno has the potential to be one of the most interesting characters in the game. Because right now, Cyno is probably the only one out of the Sumeru cast that doesn't have a clear backstory. We only know the following. 1. Cyno is from the desert. 2. He was raised in the Temple of Silence. 3. He has the spirit of Hermanubis inside of him, which he also refers to as the priestess power. 4. Said power has brought him great suffering in the past. 5. He then made his way to Sumeru and was adopted by the now retired sage of Spantamad, Cyrus. Not that Cyrus, a different Cyrus. 6. It's also hinted that Cyno got his unique sense of humor from Cyrus. And most of that information we got from a 4-minute optional dialogue between him and Lisa in the 2023 Windblume event. I can't. It honestly baffles me how Hoyo keeps doing this. That is so much lore being tucked away in a limited time event. And that conversation between Cyno and Lisa was the most lore we've gotten about his backstory out of the entire Sumeru patches. And it's because of this that a lot of people don't even know that Cyno is technically a scholar, or at least he was a student in the academia. Most people think that he was just some guy from the desert who became the academia's law enforcement. I know that we got confirmation that Cyno studied and graduated from the academia when he was made the representative of Spantamat in the Darshan competition, but again, that was a limited time event too, so not everyone has access to that information as well. So, and I guess we did get some little lore crumbs from the desert patches, like how it's revealed that it was the Temple of Silence that ordered the academia to seal all Khaenri'ah tech, and the academia for some reason just followed their orders, I guess. Like, what even is the Temple of Silence? How do they all tie in with Khaenri'ah and Cyno? And is that why Cyno somehow knows how to cleanse, seal the Archon residue in Collei's body in the webtoon? Why did he have that look on his face when confronted with Kosala's story in the Archon quest? What is up with the spirit he summons in his burst? So many questions, zero answers. There are still so many pieces missing in this Cyno-shaped puzzle, and it's honestly driving me insane. Now, don't get me wrong, this is probably all intentional on Hoyo's part. Like, if they can keep Scaramouche in their basement for 2 years to build hype, they can keep Cyno's backstory for just as long. And who knows, maybe we'll get his full backstory in the middle of Fontaine or Natlan or Snezhnaya, but I just think it's such a missed opportunity to not explore his backstory during the actual release of the Sumeru desert area that we've gotten over the past few months. Because, you know, that's where he's from, that's his origins. But hey, that's just a random person on the internet's opinion. I honestly didn't think I had this much to say about Cyno, but I love him, I love Sumeru, so I will whine and screech until I get more content about Sumeru's poster child, or at least his backstory. What are your thoughts on Cyno and his lore? Let me know in the comments, subscribe if you want, if not, that's fine too, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!